So I've been looking around the cave, trying to get used to my environment here, since I am gonna be probably spending eternity down here. And I found a small story inside of the lore cave that's a bit, creepy. So this horror story entails a GM having to erotically roleplay with one of their players after said player threatens another player's life. Yes, it's as awful as you think it is. Let's get right into it. I'll start off by giving you all some context. I've always been interested in the storytelling aspects of RPGs. However, I haven't had the greatest of experiences when trying to get into traditional TTRPGs, like Dungeons and Dragons and the like. Stories for another time. This is long enough as it is. So, around 7 and 8 years ago, while I was still in high school, some friends I met through World of Warcraft suggested that I could GM, if you can even call it that, a sort of choose-your-own-adventure style session for them that was primarily focused on plot and RP. The actual mechanics were very simplistic and pretty much only there to settle the occasional dispute, since the purpose of the whole thing was a sort of collaborative writing adventure where the main focus was to tell a story with me acting as the story's narrator. To this day, I'm not sure whether they came up with the concept on their own or if this style of play has an official name. They literally just called it a narrative RPG. I'm sure the more experienced among you can tell me whether that's a thing or not. I've never been much of a RPer, but I like to think, a passable writer, especially considering that English isn't my first language. So, in spite of my reluctance, I eventually agreed to create a narrative for their characters. Given the rules-light nature of the game, a lot of the restrictions had to be enforced by the lore, and just general common sense. But I rarely had anyone going into business for themselves, since doing so would have been counterintuitive to everyone's enjoyment. There were ways to get your character killed if you really wanted to, sure, but I had no incentive to deliberately stifle anyone, nor did the players have any reason to go out of their way to pick fights they couldn't win. Overall, it was a surprisingly fun time and gave me a chance to flex my creative muscles. I started putting more and more effort into the world, crafting stories and adventures my players could choose to partake in, with different outcomes depending on their actions or inactions. That is, until a player I'll just refer to as Jane came along. Jane started as a new and pretty active member of the World of Warcraft guild my friends and I were a part of. She and one of said friends, henceforth referred to as Loverboy XXX, because he will read this and I'm feeling petty, had apparently grown close, and we're all up in each other's DMs. Nothing wrong with that. At some point he had even told her about our group's weekly online sessions and invited her to join. I was officially introduced to Jane via voice chat, and I gave her a rundown of the setting, the current campaign's progress, and the general guidelines for designing her character. She seemed pretty receptive to it all and was eager to join in on the party's adventures, even going the extra mile by making her first character my world's equivalent of a healer so that the party, who were a tight-knit band of former cutthroats, had an incentive to bring her along. It created an interesting dynamic where Jane's sheltered character grew accustomed to the world at the same rate she did, bringing some much-needed contrast to the party's composition. If I absolutely had to nitpick, I'd say that she liked playing the role of the damsel in distress a bit too often for my liking, but no one else seemed to mind, so I refrained from commenting on it at the time. Without going into too much detail, the setting was a blend between traditional fantasy, Egyptian mythology, and Turkish folklore, where the party often had to leave the safety of the capital and venture into the untamed desert in search for long-forgotten tombs, treasures, and the like. Following the party's decision to side with the guards during an uprising, they were invited to the palace where they were to meet and be congratulated by the royal family themselves for playing a pivotal role in subduing the rebellion. Pleasantries were exchanged and meaningless titles were granted before the party were sent off back to their base in the slums. If that sounds underwhelming, it's because that was the point. I was trying to establish how detached the nobles were from the plight of their subjects. By all my efforts to write them as condescending dicks, one of the members of the royal family, who I'll just refer to as the prince for simplicity's sake, seemed to have left an impression on Jane's character. To clarify, the prince was the youngest of the king's son and the embodiment of narcissism. I wrote him to be as douchey and elitist as possible, which made the healer's sudden crush on him all the more baffling. Yes, I described him as very physically attractive, but that was literally his only redeeming quality, and there was no shortage of traditionally attractive NPCs and player characters surrounding her constantly if she really wanted to go down that route. That said, Jane's character was meant to be naive, so I figured her swooning over a guy that despises everything she represents could have been used to highlight her inexperience. Unfortunately, it was not as self-aware as I thought. Both in character and out, Jane kept bringing the prince up, much to the rest of the party's annoyance. She insisted that they fully align themselves with the crown in hopes of earning more favor, while simultaneously asking me when they were going to be meeting him again. As you can probably guess, Loverboy XXX was particularly and quite vocally against this for obvious reasons. Perhaps I should have been more stern in railroading them away from the entire plotline, but in my defense, I was really committed to adapting to everyone's choices. Jane got her way eventually, dragging everyone along with her and forcing me to come up with more and more stuff they could do for the local gentry. I made a point of clearly telling her that her efforts were appreciated, but it wasn't getting them any closer to another audience with the prince. Keep in mind, this was an NPC I hadn't even put that much thought into at the time, since I never expected him to be anything beyond an entitled prick, whose entire purpose was to symbolize the blatant disconnect between the common man and the ruling class. I could have and eventually did flesh him out more, but at the time nobody apart from Jane cared about him enough to justify doing that. Loverboy was getting pretty fed up by Jane's infatuation with my NPC, and out of character, demanded that we move on to something else. I explained that I've been presenting them with different plot hooks this entire time, but instead they just kept catering to her healer's whims, who had pretty much assumed somewhat of a de facto leader role. If nothing else, the mental image of a ragtag group of hardened outlaws following around a teenage girl pursuing her crush was somewhat amusing. So I'm just gonna come out and say, I think that's hilarious. If you feel like this derailed the campaign too much, I definitely recommend you talking to your players, or at least talking to Jane at this point and saying, hey, like, this is not what the character was meant for, or we can find something later down the line for the prince, and maybe you can do that now, but right now no one wants to do that, since it seems a lot of the party was annoyed with it, and Loverboy obviously is annoyed for another reason, just being jealous of a fictional character, but that's a whole different thing. I do still think at this point it's kind of, oh, well, everything's all right, and a bunch of, I think later on we find out these are all like 18-year-olds in high school, so all of these guys are simping over a girl that is in their party. And I'll be honest, when you're young and stupid, it's just what you do. Anyway, now let's get into the bad part. Finally picking up on the group's frustrations, Jan relented and we were allowed to move on to something else. It was at this point when Loverboy's character started trying to get closer to Jan's, which, while awkward at times, at least made sense since they had a thing IRL. Both of their characters were similar age, and it didn't interfere with my storytelling. Jane was open-minded to the idea, but didn't seem particularly excited about it. Her healer and his cutthroat continued with their in-character flirting throughout several campaigns, but their relationship never evolved past the occasional innuendo or remark. All was well until the fateful evening when I saw that Jane had messaged me several times on Skype. When I opened our conversation, I saw paragraph upon paragraph of her, I'm assuming in character since most of it was surrounded by quotation marks, proclaiming her love for the prince and straight up demanding to meet him again. It's been a long time, so I don't remember exactly what she said, but I distinctly remember her threatening to leave the friend group altogether if I didn't make it happen. She went on to guilt trip me by saying that it would have been my fault if Loverboy XXX, I kid you not, killed himself over her leaving without a word, since she was apparently helping him battle through some mental issues none of us were aware of. I suddenly had no idea how to react. I remember just sitting there, reading through her messages and trying to formulate some sort of adequate reply in my head. Oh my I did say it was gonna get worse. If you ever find yourself so enthralled by a fictional character that you are willing to threaten a real person's life, please take a moment to take a step back. Being enthralled by a storytelling experience is fine, but becoming this obsessed, especially with something that is not real, is a very unhealthy thing. Person might be going through something mentally as well, where they clung to this personality that they might like because of whatever it may be, even though it seems that the character originally wasn't fleshed out well. We don't know what's going inside of Jane's head, but never, I mean, never should anyone threaten someone else's life over wanting to ERP with someone. Okay, sorry, let's close this out. Eventually, I settled on the worst thing I could have probably done. I proposed to narrate a private, non-canon exchange between her healer and my NPC. Obviously, she agreed and was pretty enthusiastic about it, as though she hadn't just threatened my friend's mental health in order to get her way. I have no excuse for choosing to indulge her instead of immediately talking to Loverboy about the whole thing. I guess I was worried both about him and scared of our friend group disbanding, which eventually happened anyway, but over an unrelated incident. Fast forward to the day of my private session with Jane. The scene opens with the prince standing on a balcony overlooking the royal garden and her character being invited into his quarters. I obviously knew what she was after, so I made up some bullshit reason as to why he had taken a sudden interest in her. I don't remember what it was exactly. Both expressed their inexplicable infatuation with each other, and things obviously got heated, so I hurried to a fade to black. Only Jane wasn't having it. She was basically expecting me to ERP with her, something I've never done and had no interest in doing. I explained to her that at the time, I wasn't really interested in exploring sexual stuff, both in and out of character. Cue the porn. Cue the porn. I've trained long and hard to become the lore keeper for the lore cave, and never did I realize I would read someone's story and see cue the porn. That's right, folks. Jane seemed to have thought that all I needed was some inspiration, and so, in her infinite wisdom, proceeded spamming me pictures and gifs of explicit acts she wanted my character to do to hers. Then she went on to make the whole thing 10 times weirder by expressing how this sort of content was making her feel. Though both of us were 18 at the time, I still don't feel comfortable recounting her exact words verbatim. Let's just say that she was making me increasingly uncomfortable until she left me no choice but to tell her off, which she took as well as you expected. She left the group soon after and blocked us all, including Loverboy XXX, who took it hard, but got over it after confiding in the rest of us instead. Not sure what Jane has been up to since then. I had seen her mentioned in passing a few times before our WoW guild got disbanded for good, since most of us moved on to other games and hobbies. Apparently she's currently married, so I genuinely wish her all the best, and hopefully that she has grown as a person since the above mentioned incident. Only recently did me and Loverboy XXX reconnect. Who you can thank for reminding me about Jane and directing me to the subreddit. It's a mildly uncomfortable experience at best compared to the other stories I've read on here, but I thought it might still be worth sharing. Edit, just to be clear, I'm not implying that my friend did anything wrong in this scenario. The ridiculous nickname I've given him is just a harmless in-joke between us that I like teasing him about. Alright, I'm happy that the writer ended up seeing this as just a weird, uncomfortable experience that they are happy to share now, and I am also hoping the best for Jane. A great thing to take is a lot of us are cringy through middle school and high school so that we're not cringy later on in life. And if she is generally married and happy, then hopefully she is past that cringe of wanting to ERP with random people, or at least she found someone who is willing to do it with her in holy matrimony. Alright, that's it for me for today. This was a longer one than the last, and this writer has a few more stories that I have to kind of sift through. This has been the Lore Keeper of the Lore Cave, and I hope to see you all again.